So I'm going to talk about scenarios for financial disclosure. This is a relatively new topic. The story begins with the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors coming together and being concerned about the kinds of recessions that were driven by financial crises and thinking forward into what might be a problem that could be headed off. And so they chartered the Financial Stability Board to review how the financial sector could take account of climate-related risks. And the Financial Stability Board then turned around and they established something called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD, and then chartered it to begin a process of trying to figure out how do we do a better job in promoting more informed investment, credit, and insurance underwriting decisions, which in turn would enable stakeholders to understand better the concentrations of carbon-related assets and climate liabilities that they have in their system. And they undertook the very first meeting just about 2 years ago, February 8th in London. And so that's the start of this story. The task force then, in the process of its first meeting, recognized that you really did, lots of the actors needed it. The issuers of financial risk statements needed it. Investors, lenders, regulators, they all needed this, and therefore they needed some way of getting the kind of information that they needed. And they began by identifying the kinds of risks that needed to be taken into account. There's, on the risk side, there is the policies that might drive climate change and deep decarbonization that in turn could drive technological change, could change markets, could change the way that entities were, their reputations, and also the physical environment in which the firms were operating, and then the opportunities that those created. And then they recommended that these risks and opportunities be incorporated into the strategic planning and the financial impact statements. And so their primary recommendation was that the organizations provide climate-related financial disclosures in their mainstream annual financial filings. And so this is where scenarios raise their ugly heads. And the TCFD then began looking at, well, what do we need in terms of scenarios? If we're going to look forward into the future, we're going to include this stuff in strategic planning. What kinds of scenarios are needed? And they identified at least two different kinds of scenarios. They wanted scenarios that would be able to speak, as I said, to the physical environment and the changing climatic conditions, both acute and long-lived, as well as the policy environment in which these organizations were going to be operating. And they specifically recommended that disclosure statements should be taking on board these 2 degrees scenarios as the minimum lower limit on the policy side of the house. And so they recommended that the 2-degree scenarios be used by organizations, that the organizations not make up their own scenarios, but actually go out into the open, publicly available literature looking for referenced developed by independent bodies, scenarios that were publicly available, where you could download the data sets, where they were updated regularly to bring into account new information as those data became available. And then looking forward to connecting those to the development of new tools, visualization software, calculators, mapping tools. And here you see 4 different scenarios that were called out. These are scenarios that were developed by the IPCC. The RCPs in the upper panel are the emissions, and we've seen these before. The blue at the bottom is the 2-degree scenario. It's RCP 2.6, which is 2.6 watts per meter squared radiative forcing in the year 2100, and then scenarios that range upward to 8.5, which was highest in the open literature at the time. And then from the climate models, which provide a forward look into the climatic conditions that might be experienced going forward, the corresponding climate model archive is called the CMIP archive, and is from the Climate Model Intercomparison Project, which then in turn provides a wealth of information about potential climatic conditions that are driven by these RCPs. And so they call out the availability of scenarios that have publicly availability as a characteristic. The IEA scenarios, we saw a report on IEA scenarios this morning. Those that were developed by the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Program, those developed by ARENA, Greenpeace, as well as those developed for the IPCC by the Integrated Assessment Modeling Consortium. And on the physical side, as I said, the climatic conditions. That takes us into the realm of integrated assessment models, where you actually have the ability, as we saw this morning, and we discussed it at some length, these models that actually bring together representations of how the energy system, the land systems, the economic systems, and the physical Earth systems all interact. And they typically generate output that includes the energy systems, the land systems, how land is used, what's on the landscape, the emissions associated, the investment patterns that are required to achieve the scenario, the technologies available, the technology development pathways, the price paths for the markets for goods and services in the energy and agriculture and land and other markets, macroeconomic impacts, and a variety of sustainability indicators like local air quality, water quality, and so forth. What, of course, we also heard this morning was that these scenarios, while they're very detailed, are also contingent. These are not absolute forecasts. They are contingent forecasts. And they're contingent on getting all the inputs right. And the inputs are big things. They include, the socioeconomic drivers. They include, for example, how many people are there, what's the age structure, where are they located, and then labor productivity. How fast is labor productivity growing? This may not be a huge uncertainty for developed economies, but for developing economies, this is a huge uncertainty. What technologies are going to be available? What's the performance? How does that performance change over time? And perhaps as important as anything, what's the policy environment in which all of this is going to be undertaken? And so these are contingent scenarios. And I'll just remind us of one of the things we talked about in the morning, how different the world is when you have CO2 capture and storage or not. And this is just one technology, its availability or not. Everything else is being held constant here. And so you see this pattern that we saw earlier. You've got 6 different sectors here in the rectangles, and then within each one of the sectoral rectangles, you'll see an outline of the range in the open literature for the 5th assessment report of the IPCC in the white, and then the colored is the 25th and 75th percentile, and the dark line is the median of the data set. And so you see land use, you see electricity, you see transport, and you see the change over time from a reference scenario, which is in this semi-transparent state in the back, as you move from that to a 2-degree scenario. The power sector is most notable in that it goes to 0 by the middle of the century and then keeps going negative when CO2 capture and storage is available. And so you have a very heavy emphasis on the power sector and its ability to offset what's going on over in the non-CO2 greenhouse gases. over there in the far right, because those are very difficult to remove from the system. They're difficult because you've got things like nitrous oxide emissions that are associated with the application of fertilizer to grow crops. You have the cattle that are still around in most of the scenarios. You have people still eating rice. You have all kinds of emissions that are really difficult to get out of the system, and that's why you need these negative emissions to offset those. And so we just flash over to without CCS. If you go to the without CCS, you see a dramatic change in this picture because the electricity sector goes to zero, but it doesn't keep going. And so that needs to be offset by a fundamental change in land use, the application of land to growing new forests to offset. These are really different scenarios in their structure, both geographically, but also technically and technologically. So the TCFD, in its infinite wisdom, and the Bank of England set about to try to get the people who make scenarios together with the people who are the potential consumers of scenarios for financial risk and strategic planning. And they did this in October 31st and November 1st. And they got brought together the Integrated Assessment Modeling Consortium representatives, people from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, from the Potsdam Institute that we've heard from already today, as well as others, and representatives from the IEA. Along with private sector representatives from the gas, the utilities, materials, automobile, financial, and consultants, to talk about how would you bring this about. There was a lot of conversation, a lot of meetings, and the start has been made. The recommendations coming out of this particular conference were that you really need to make scenario analysis more widely available for strategic planning. You needed to create opportunities for exchange between the people who are making scenarios and the potential users. You needed to develop methods that investors could use to connect these scenarios, which were never designed in the first place to be used directly by financial analysts. And you needed to make existing scenario data more readily available. It needed to be better documented. You needed visualization tools. You needed ways to get at it. You needed tutorials. You needed anchor scenarios. You needed some place that you could go and get a scenario that you didn't have to begin and customize from the very beginning. The one that, this is the one that would be used as default. So the anchor scenarios were required. The business of connecting the scenarios and the business community is actually already begun, and I just downloaded this the other day from Cicero, in which they have this tutorial on how to demystify this whole climate scenario process. And then finally, going out of this, it was, as I said, more questions than answers, questions about the data, the granularity of the information that's being provided, the context for the scenarios, the complexity and transparency, what do the need to have for a scenario that's going to be used for financial disclosure, what are the standards for selection, what's the standard for documentation, and what's the process? What are the institutions, what are the interfaces that are going to be made available. And so at this point in time, we are at the very beginning of a process in which scenarios are going to make their way from the research community into the financial world.